There is a kind of person you have probably noticed. You have seen them in difficult meetings, when the pressure in the room becomes something almost physical. You have seen them when plans collapsed without warning, when someone said something designed to wound, when circumstances turned against everything that had been carefully arranged. And what you noticed, what stayed with you, was not what they said. It was what they didn't do. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't shrink. They didn't reach for excuses or scatter into visible anxiety. They simply remained, composed, present, somehow unmoved by the very things that had everyone else off balance. And you probably felt two things at once: admiration and something quieter beneath it, a question you didn't quite form into words. How do they do that? Most people, when they first encounter genuine composure, make the same mistake. They assume it is the absence of feeling, that the person who doesn't react simply doesn't care, that composure is a kind of emotional distance, a wall built between a person and the life happening around them. This is understandable. It is also completely wrong. And that misunderstanding is worth examining carefully, because it is precisely what keeps most people trapped in a pattern they genuinely want to escape. Think about the last time something small ruined your day. Not a catastrophe, not a genuine loss. Something small, a comment from someone whose opinion you didn't even particularly value, a plan that fell apart in a minor way, a moment of public embarrassment that no one else will remember next week, something that, measured against the full length of your life, barely registers. And yet it stayed with you. It followed you through the rest of the afternoon. It sat with you at dinner. It was still there when you were trying to sleep, replaying itself with the particular cruelty that small frustrations somehow specialize in. You didn't choose that. You wouldn't have chosen it. But something inside you handed that moment a permission it probably didn't deserve. Most people have never stopped to ask why. There is a pattern here that appears across every culture, every generation, every level of success and education and intelligence. It has nothing to do with weakness of character. It has nothing to do with being too sensitive or too emotional or insufficiently disciplined. It has to do with something much simpler and much more specific. It has to do with where a person has placed their sense of who they are. Consider for a moment what actually happens when something disturbs you, not the emotion itself, that is a result. Think about what had to be true before the emotion arrived. Something outside you, a word, an outcome, a person's reaction, a situation you didn't control, reached inside and touched something. It landed on something that mattered. Not because the thing itself was objectively important, but because somewhere, beneath awareness, you had connected your sense of yourself to it. Your worth, your standing, your sense that things were going according to a plan that meant something. When that connection exists, disturbance is not a character flaw. It is almost mathematical. If your sense of who you are lives outside of you, in results, in how others see you, in whether the day goes the way you arranged it, then every unexpected thing that touches those results, that perception, that arrangement, feels like a threat. Not to your plans, to you. The person you admired in that difficult room had not stopped caring about outcomes. They had not become indifferent to how things turned out. They were not numb. They had simply built their sense of self somewhere that external events could not easily reach. That is the difference. Not temperament, not luck, not some inherited ability to feel less. A decision made perhaps unconsciously, over time, through experience and reflection, about where to place the foundation of identity. And because it is a decision, it can be learned. The ancient Stoic philosophers understood this with remarkable clarity. They are often misrepresented. People hear the word Stoic and imagine someone cold and distant, someone who has trained themselves not to feel, someone who regards emotion as a kind of personal failure. This is not what they taught. What they actually taught was a precise and practical idea about the architecture of a human life. They drew a simple line. On one side of the line, everything inside your control, your judgments, your values, how you choose to respond, the standards you hold yourself to, the character you build, quietly, through the decisions no one else sees. On the other side, everything outside your control, other people's opinions, outcomes, the weather, how the day decides to arrange itself. what someone says about you in a room you're not in. Their observation, tested across centuries of human experience, was this: suffering, in most of its chronic and unnecessary forms, comes from placing your identity on the wrong side of that line. Not from life being difficult. Life has always been difficult. From needing things on the outside to remain stable in order to feel stable on the inside. Marcus Aurelius understood this perhaps better than anyone. He was, for a significant portion of his life, the most powerful man in the known world. Emperor of Rome, commander of its armies, final authority over its laws, its territories, its people. A position that would have given most people every reason to believe that external control was not only possible but guaranteed. And yet every morning, before he governed anything, he sat alone and wrote to himself. Not plans, not strategies, not lists of what needed to be accomplished. Reflections on how to remain composed, how to respond rather than react, how to govern his own interior before he governed anything outside of it. He wrote about being insulted and choosing not to be injured by it, about plans collapsing and finding that his sense of direction did not collapse with them, about the particular wisdom of understanding that the obstacle in the road is not, ultimately, the problem. The problem is always the condition of the person standing in front of it. He was not writing from a position of easy comfort. He governed during plague, during war, during the kind of sustained pressure that would have dismantled most people entirely. And he kept writing those same reflections every morning because he understood that composure is not something you have. It is something you practice, something you build, something that requires daily attention, not because it is fragile, but because it is in fact a form of construction. And all construction requires maintenance. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man in the ancient world did not believe that power protected him from disturbance. He believed that inner discipline was the only real protection that existed, and that it required deliberate daily practice. If that was true for him, surrounded by every external advantage imaginable, what does that suggest about where composure actually comes from? Here is something worth noticing. The people in your life who are most easily disturbed are rarely the ones with the most problems. Often they have ordinary lives, ordinary frustrations, ordinary setbacks, the same texture of difficulty that everyone else navigates. What they have is a particular sensitivity to external conditions, a nervous system, so to speak, that has learned to treat outside circumstances as inside threats. And the people who remain composed, they are not people who have arranged their lives to avoid difficulty. Often they have faced more difficulty than most. What they have developed is a different relationship between the outside and the inside. They have, through intention or through hard experience, stopped placing the source of their stability somewhere it can be taken away. This is the idea worth sitting with as we continue. Not the performance of composure, not the technique of appearing calm while remaining internally turbulent. The deeper question, where have you placed the foundation of your sense of self? Because everything else, every reaction you've regretted, every time something small stole more of your peace than it deserved, every moment you've admired in someone else and wondered if it was available to you, everything traces back to that. The storm was never the problem. The question was always what you were built from. There is a question that most people never think to ask, not because they lack the intelligence to ask it, but because the answer, once seen clearly, requires something from them. And the mind, quietly, protectively, tends to avoid questions whose answers come with responsibility attached. The question is this: why does the same event destroy one person's entire day and pass through another person's life almost without leaving a mark? Same event, same words, same circumstance. Two completely different experiences of it. We tend to explain this away quickly. He's just more relaxed by nature. She grew up differently. Some people are simply built that way. We reach for explanations that place the difference outside of choice, because if it's outside of choice, we are relieved of the work of choosing. But that explanation doesn't hold. And somewhere, most people already know it doesn't. Consider what actually happens inside a person the moment something disturbs them. Psychologists who study this area have noticed something precise and somewhat uncomfortable. They call it identity contingent self-esteem. It is a long phrase for a simple and very human condition. It means this: when a person's sense of their own worth has been attached to something outside themselves, an outcome, an approval, a result, a reputation, then any threat to that thing registers not as an inconvenience. It registers as a threat to existence itself. The nervous system, in its ancient and somewhat unsophisticated way, does not distinguish well between a bruised ego and a broken bone, between someone dismissing your idea in a meeting and someone questioning your right to be in the room at all, between a plan falling apart and a life falling apart. When identity lives outside, the nervous system treats everything that touches it as an emergency, and you cannot think clearly in an emergency. You cannot respond well in an emergency. You can only react. This is worth pausing on, because most people experience this as a personal failure, as evidence of some weakness in their character. They react to something they wish they hadn't reacted to, and then they spend hours judging themselves for the reaction, adding a second layer of disturbance on top of the first. But the reaction was not a character flaw. It was information. Every time something outside you reaches inside you and moves you further than you wanted to be. Moved, that is the interior life showing you exactly where it has placed its foundations. Not as a criticism, as a map. Think about a well-built structure. A craftsman who knows his work does not build a table and then worry. Every time something is placed on it, whether the table will hold, the stability was built into the table long before the weight arrived. The joints were considered. The material was chosen. The construction was done with enough care and enough patience that when the moment of pressure comes, nothing dramatic happens. The table simply holds, because that is what it was built to do. Now consider a table built quickly, built without attention to the joints, built from materials chosen for appearance rather than strength. That table may look identical to the first one, may even be praised for how it looks. But the moment real weight arrives, not excessive weight, simply real weight, something shifts. Something creaks. Something reveals itself. Not because the weight was unreasonable, because the construction was insufficient. Most people, through no fault of their own, have built their interior life the way that second table was built. Not from laziness, not from weakness, simply because no one taught them that interior construction was something that required attention, that it was something you had to do deliberately, over time, with the same care you would give to anything you wanted to last. They built their sense of self from available materials, other people's approval, early successes, the reflection they saw in how others treated them, outcomes that confirmed they were on the right path, and those materials work until the weight arrives. Here is what changes everything. The person who remains composed under pressure has not found a way to avoid pressure. They have not arranged their circumstances to be consistently favorable. They have not suppressed their emotional life into a controlled and quiet performance. They have moved the foundation, not outside, where results live, where opinions live, where the unpredictable behavior of other people and the world lives. Inside, where something more durable lives, their values, their standards, the kind of person they have decided to be, regardless of how the day resolves itself. The commitments they keep, not because someone is watching, but because the keeping of them is itself the source of self-respect. When identity lives there, external events change character. They become information rather than verdicts. They become weather rather than definitions. The difficult conversation is still difficult. The failure still stings. The unfair criticism still lands. But none of it reaches the foundation, because the foundation is not located where those things can touch it. There is a difference, and it is important to feel this distinction rather than simply understand it intellectually, between suppression and composure. Suppression says, I feel this completely, and I am forcing it down, and the effort of forcing it down is itself exhausting me. Composure says, I notice this. I am not threatened by it. It does not require the full emergency response of my interior life, because my interior life has not been placed in its path. Suppression is a performance. It is tiring. It is temporary, and it tends to collapse precisely when the pressure becomes serious, which is exactly when you need it most. Composure is structural. It is not achieved in the moment of difficulty. It is built in the long quiet before the moment of difficulty arrives. And when the moment arrives, it does not feel like holding something back. It feels like simply being who you already are. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that has stayed with serious students of human nature for nearly 2,000 years. He observed that people are disturbed not by the things that happen to them, but by the judgments they form about those things. Read that slowly. Not by what happens, by the judgment formed about what happens. Two people receive the same piece of criticism. One forms the judgment. This means I am not good enough. The other forms the judgment. This is information I can use. Same criticism. Entirely different interior experience. Entirely different response. The difference is not sensitivity. The difference is not toughness. The difference is where each person has placed the authority to define them. One has placed that authority in the criticism itself. So the criticism arrives with the power to determine their worth. The other has kept that authority inside. So the criticism arrives as data, potentially useful, potentially mistaken, but carrying no power to reach the foundation. Where have you placed that authority? It is worth sitting with that question honestly. Not as self-criticism, not as a reason to feel behind or lacking in something. Simply as an honest look at the architecture of your interior life. Because most people, if they are honest, will notice that the authority has drifted outward, gradually, naturally, in response to years of living in a world that constantly offers external measures of worth, approval, performance, comparison, results. It drifts outward without announcement. And then one day, something small disturbs you more than it should have, and you wonder why you are this way, and the question feels larger than it has any right to be. This is why. The recovery of that authority, the gradual, patient work of returning the source of stability to somewhere it cannot be taken from, is not a dramatic process. It does not happen in a single decision. It happens in the accumulation of small ones. It happens every time you choose not to check, one more time, whether someone approved of what you said. Every time you finish something to the standard you set, not the standard you think will be praised. Every time a difficulty arrives and you pause, just long enough to ask, does this actually threaten who I am, or only what I hoped would happen? Every time you notice the gap between those two questions, because that gap between what threatens you and what has actually been threatened is the space in which composure lives. And the more honestly you examine it, the wider that gap becomes. There is something else worth understanding. Composure is not invisible to the people around you. In fact, it is one of the most visible things a person can carry. Not because it announces itself, it never announces itself, but because it creates a kind of gravity, a steadiness that others feel before they can name it. Think about the person you most respect in your life. Not the most successful person you know. Not the most talented, the most respected. Consider how they behave when things go wrong, when the pressure increases, when someone says something designed to provoke them, or diminish them, or test whether they can. Be moved. Notice how much of your respect for them comes specifically from that, from the fact that they cannot easily be moved. Composure is not a private achievement. It becomes, inevitably, a form of quiet leadership. Because in a world where most people are reacting to most things, the person who responds deliberately carries an authority that has nothing to do with title or position or volume. It comes simply from the visible fact of a person who knows where they stand. And that is precisely what we need to examine next. Because knowing where you stand requires more than understanding the concept. It requires making a decision about what, from this point forward, will be permitted to define you, and what will not. There is a moment that arrives quietly in the life of every person who eventually develops genuine composure. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not arrive with clarity or announcement. It is rarely recognized for what it is, until much later, looking back. It is simply the moment a person decides, not emotionally, not in the heat of some difficulty, but quietly and with full awareness, that they are no longer willing to let things outside their mind. Control determine the condition of things inside. Not as a protest, not as a wall, as a standard. A standard is different from a decision made in frustration. A decision made in frustration says, I refuse to let this bother me. It is reactive. It is temporary. It lasts precisely until the next provocation arrives with enough force to override it. A standard says something quieter and more permanent. This is not where I place my stability. Not because I am suppressing something, but because I have chosen something more durable to build on. The difference between those two positions is the difference between someone performing composure and someone who has actually built it. And the building, this is what most people miss, does not happen in the difficult moment. It happens in every ordinary moment before it. Think about what you actually do with the quiet hours of your life. Not the dramatic ones. Not the ones that test you visibly. The ordinary ones. The morning before anyone else is awake. The small decisions made when no one is watching and nothing is at stake. The promises kept to yourself when breaking them would cost you nothing externally. The standards maintained not because someone will notice, but because you will. These moments are invisible. They are also everything. Because the person you become in the visible moments, under pressure, in conflict, when something lands that was designed to destabilize you, is assembled entirely from the person you have been choosing to be in the invisible ones. Composure is not summoned in the crisis. It is recognized there. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the people you admire for their root, steadiness. They did not develop it by facing extraordinary difficulty with extraordinary willpower. They developed it by paying careful attention to something most people overlook entirely. They paid attention to where they were placing their sense of worth in the ordinary moments. They noticed, gradually and honestly, every time they reached outside themselves for confirmation that they were enough. Every time they adjusted their behavior to manage someone else's perception. Every time they felt the pull to check, one more time, whether the result had validated them. And slowly, through that honest attention, they began withdrawing that authority from things that had no right to hold it. Not all at once, gradually, the way all genuine things develop. Consider the nature of a lighthouse. It was not built for calm weather. On a clear night, with no ships in difficulty and no storms approaching, a lighthouse is almost unremarkable. It simply stands. It does what it does, without audience, without acknowledgement. Its purpose reveals itself only when the storm arrives. And when the storm arrives, when the waves are serious and the wind is doing everything in its power to disrupt anything not firmly anchored, the lighthouse does not argue with the storm. It does not react to the waves. It does not adjust its position based on the direction the wind is coming from. It simply continues doing what it was built to do. Not because it cannot feel the storm, but because it was built from something the storm cannot rearrange. That is the only question worth asking about any structure, including a human one. Not whether it will ever face a storm, but what it was built from. You have, at some point in your life, already been the lighthouse. There was a moment, perhaps you remember it, perhaps it has blurred with time, when something difficult arrived and you did not collapse, when something unfair happened and you responded with a steadiness that surprised even you, when someone said something designed to diminish you and you found, somewhere inside, a floor that held. You did not perform that. You found it, which means it was already there. The question is not whether you are capable of this. You have already demonstrated that you are. The question is whether you are willing to build it more deliberately, to give it more of your attention, to stop leaving it to circumstance and begin treating it as something that deserves the same care you would give to anything that genuinely matters to you. The practical path forward is not complicated. It does not require a system. It does not require that you change your personality or practice a technique or repeat a phrase to yourself every morning. It requires one honest question, asked regularly and answered without self-deception. Where am I placing my stability right now? Not as a judgment of the answer, simply as an observation. If the answer is, in whether this person approves of what I said, notice that, not with shame, with curiosity. And then ask the quieter question beneath it, what would it mean if they didn't? Follow that question honestly until you reach the actual belief underneath it. Because most of the time, when you trace the reaction back far enough, you find something that was never objectively true, only assumed. A belief that approval from this particular person, in this particular moment, has something to do with your actual worth. And once you see that clearly enough, once the assumption is visible, rather than operating silently in the background, it begins to lose the authority it had when it was invisible. This is how the foundation moves. Not through force, through clarity. Begin with something specific, not a philosophy, not a commitment to be more composed in general. That is too large to be useful and too vague to be kept. One thing. Identify one external condition that you have been granting more authority than it deserves. One thing outside your control that you have been treating as though it has the power to determine your interior state. It may be a particular person's opinion. It may be a specific kind of outcome. It may be the need for a day to arrange itself the way you planned it, and the quiet disturbance that arrives when it doesn't. Whatever it is, name it. Not to eliminate the feeling, not to pretend it isn't there, simply to make it visible. Because what you can see clearly, you can begin to make a choice about. And the choice, made once, and then again the next day, and then again the day after that, gradually becomes the foundation you didn't know you were building. Until one day, something that would have disturbed you entirely simply doesn't reach that far. Not because you suppressed it, not because you stopped caring, but because the foundation has moved to somewhere that thing cannot touch. The person you admired in that difficult room did not arrive there through talent. They arrived through accumulated decision, through the quiet, largely invisible work of gradually withdrawing authority from things that had no right to hold it, through paying attention to where their sense of self was living, and slowly, patiently, moving it somewhere more durable, through choosing, in ordinary moment after ordinary moment, to build from the inside out. That work is available to you, not tomorrow, not after the next difficulty has passed and conditions are more favorable. It begins in the next quiet moment you have with yourself, with one honest question, with one honest answer, and then the slow, patient, entirely possible work of building something the storm cannot rearrange. The storm was never the problem. It never is. The question was always what you were built from.